so much for joining us this evening for our Historic Neighborhoods of Indianapolis series. I'm Liz Ellis. I'm the Executive Director here at the Indianapolis Propoleum. If you have questions for Susan, if you would type them down in the chat feature down at the bottom, that would be great. She's going to answer as many questions as she can at the end. The Propoleum was founded in 1888 by renowned suffragist and activist May Wright Sewell as a place where women and women's groups could meet and share ideas. We carry on that tradition today through our mission as the place that connects and celebrates women. Our mission focus is women's leadership, arts and culture, and historic preservation. As a nonprofit, we count on your support to provide engaging programming like tonight. Please take a look at our website, www.thepropoleum.org, for all of our upcoming virtual events and to support the Propoleum. We hope that you'll join us at the Prop when we're able to all gather together again in person. Our program tonight is presented by Dr. Susan Hyatt. Susan is a professor of anthropology at Indiana University, Purdue University in Indianapolis. She received her BA in anthropology from Grinnell College and her MA from the University of Michigan before working for 8 years as a community organizer in Chicago. She then returned to her studies at the University of Massachusetts, where she completed her PhD in 1996. It was her experience in Chicago that shaped her commitment to involving her students in collaborative research with neighborhood partners. She's the founder and director of the Neighborhood of Saturdays project, which tells the story of the bonds between the Jewish and African-American communities who lived together on Indianapolis's near Southside during the first part of the 20th century. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Susan Hyatt.
All right, thank you so much, Liz, for that nice introduction. I'm going to do a share screen now and pull up my PowerPoint, which I have to tell you is way too long. So I'm gonna have to really rush through it. So as Liz said, the South Side, of course, is a huge area if we were to consider everything south of Washington Street to the city limits. So I'm going to be talking about my very special part of the South Side, which is the area that we refer to based on the project that Liz referred to as the Neighborhood of Saturdays. And that's really the area between Washington and Morris and Madison and West, more or less. And I'm going to be talking about that community really for the most of the presentation is about that community in the first part of the 20th century. And in some ways, the South Side was the Ellis Island of Indianapolis. A lot of immigrant groups came through there, including Greeks, Germans, Irish. As a matter of fact, the Irish and the Germans were probably there first, Italians. But I'm focusing on two particular communities, and that's the African-American community and the Jewish immigrant community. All of those folks settled there around the same time and developed some very interesting social relationships and friendships with one another that I'm going to talk about. So, I mean, this picture on the left is an ad for Coke, as you can see from the Harry E. Wood 1967 yearbook. So I think that's a kind of interesting representation of the neighborhood. The other two are pictures from our Neighborhood of Saturdays archive, and the link to that archive, which includes a link to the book that you can download, is in the chat. So as everybody who's from Indianapolis knows, and from other cities, people would know this as well, the cities were drastically changed by the construction of the interstates in the 60s and 70s. And I-70 cut right through the near South Side. And you can see all the houses and the parcels that were taken out. And this isn't even the whole, the whole outline of I-70. This is just one part of the neighborhood. But a student from Ball State who's just done a very interesting project on the South Side, excuse me, he estimates that 17,000 people were displaced during that construction. So we're all familiar with this landscape after the construction of I-70, but I'm going to try to restore it to you. I mean, I don't have memories of the South Side before this. I didn't move here until 2004, but I've kind of taken on a sort of imagination of what the neighborhood was like based on the interviews that we've done and the old pictures that we've collected. So I'm going to try to communicate some of that to you. I think it's a really fascinating story and one that deserves to be better known in Indianapolis. So here's a little sort of diagram that in some ways shows the changing demographics of just one block, the 1100 block of South Capitol. I believe Ms. Pete, who is on the call, has property on that block, and I see that she does at 1146 South Capitol. If you look on the left in 1936, you can see the predominance of Jewish surnames. And so this was a very heavily settled area by the Jewish immigrants who came to Indianapolis at that time. There were also two African-American families who had a long presence in that area, the Dabneys and the Proctors. If we look in 1963, you can see that there are far fewer recognizably Jewish names. It's hard to tell sometimes, but Mrs. Proctor is still there. Joseph Miller was Ms. Pete's husband, was at 11, and her family was at 1146. And we still have Mrs. Goldie Bergman, which is the most recognizably Jewish name remaining, at 1150. So some of the quotes that we had are on the right-hand side, or my right, just talking about the relationship among these two communities on the South Side. And Mr. Kraft talked about going to Public School 22, which was integrated. And you'll see some pictures of the schools in a few minutes, the schools from that neighborhood. So I've kind of organized the presentation to be businesses, leisure, primary schools. I'm not going to talk about the high schools, which is a very complicated topic and could take another whole presentation, and the Southside Jewish community, which I think is a somewhat under-recognized part of Indianapolis's history. These are some pictures from our Neighborhood of Saturdays archive. Terry's Market was very fondly remembered as a shop that was owned by a Jewish immigrant, Albert Hazen. You can see him in the bottom picture, but was patronized by everyone. You can see in the color picture on the right where it used to stand, and you can see I-70 in the background. And on the far right, I like this picture in particular because it's very clear where exactly this was, that this location is now the entrance to the west parking lot of Lucas Oil Stadium. So it wasn't only I-70 that changed the look of the South Side and the community. It was certainly big projects like Lucas Oil Stadium. So our first little section is going to be about some of the South Side businesses. There's a picture of what Meridian used to look like, probably in the early 60s. And the first establishment that I'm going to talk about is Passo's Drugstore, which is another Southside institution very fondly remembered by members of both the African-American and Jewish community, and I'm sure by other communities. So now you know this corner, I'm sure, if you're from Indianapolis, because this is the corner of McCarty and Meridian, and you can see Shapiro's, and Shapiro's now extends to McCarty, but originally, Shapiro's was one end of the building and the other end of the building was Passo's Drugstore. The Passos were a Jewish immigrant family, and they were fondly remembered because you remember in 1938, in the 40s, 50s, Indianapolis was still very segregated, but Passo's was never segregated. And Mr. William Craig was one of our African-American elders whom unfortunately we lost in the last year or two. And he says Passo's was not segregated. They had a counter, they had a fountain where you'd stand up and you could get cherry Cokes and stuff like that. Al Paso and his brother Issy owned the drugstore. And the story, the second story is about how close the neighborhood was. An African-American woman who told us about how she once had a temper tantrum at Passo's because she couldn't have something that she wanted. And Mr. Paso just picked up the phone and called her mom. So that's how close people's relationships were. This is a picture of a young Leah Goldstein standing outside of Passo's Drugs. I'm not sure what year that was, but a long time ago. And Charlie and Al Passo were two of the three Passo brothers that founded Passo's Drug. Charlie left and went on to do something else. And Al and Issy are the people that everybody remembers very fondly and reminisces about. Now, in 1976, there was a gas leak that caused Passo's to explode and to catch on fire. And miraculously, no one was seriously injured. But after that, Al and Issy decided to retire, and the building was owned by the founder of Shapiro's. Max Shapiro owned the whole building, and so they just extended Shapiro's into that part of the building. South Meridian, between McCarty and Morris, was a very densely kind of populated commercial strip with a lot of Jewish-owned businesses. But there were some businesses owned by other people from other communities as well, including the B&M Tavern that was owned by Edgar Johnson, and was a Black establishment. And you can see it's just a few doors down from Passo's and from Shapiro's. Regan Bakery was another Jewish-owned business. And I love this picture of Rosetta Crane and Mary Johnson working at the B&M Tavern in the 70s. The Johnsons, like many of the other African-American families, migrated up to Indianapolis from the South in the 30s, 40s, even 20s. And a lot of them told us in the interviews that they ended up staying on the South Side because that's where Union Station was. And people would get off at Union Station and be looking around for housing and would discover this community on the South Side. Here's Mr. Edgar Johnson. I think this is a terrific photo. And Ms. Johnson, Ms. Brenda Marie Johnson, who sadly we lost some years ago, but she wrote a little piece for the book, The Story of the B&M Tavern. And I think this is a great illustration of the relationships between the Black and the Jewish community on the South Side, communities on the South Side. And she wrote, before long, Uncle Edgar and Aunt May got a break from the Jewish tavern owner by the name of Mal Bracken. Mr. Bracken's tavern was located in the same block as Shapiro's. And Mr. Bracken sold Uncle and Aunt May the building and the liquor license, and so began his second business endeavor with the B&M Tavern. If I'm not mistaken, Uncle was the first Black man who owned a business on the well-known South Meridian Street strip. And I love this ad from the Recorder from 1970, the grand opening of the newly decorated B&M Tavern. Meet your friends here for a swinging time. People who know about the history of Indianapolis think about the Black Entertainment District as having been concentrated on Indiana Avenue, which indeed it was, but there were venues in other parts of the city as well that perhaps aren't as well known. The next institution or business that I'm going to talk about is the Oriental Theater. I just can't believe it was torn down. It was torn down because it's right where I-70 comes across Meridian, but it must have just been an astonishing building and astonishingly looking building, built in kind of this description says a Japanese style of architecture. The grand opening of the Oriental Theater at 1105 South Meridian, so I believe it was Meridian and Wilkins, was in 1913. Here's a couple of other pictures of the theater, quite a remarkable style of architecture with little shops on the ground floor, including one that was, I think, a candy store where kids would buy their refreshments for the movies. Now, the Oriental Theater has something of a problematic history in that it was segregated when it was first opened. And there were stories that during its era as a segregated space, some of the Jewish neighborhood kids would sneak their Black friends in through the fire exit after the lights went down. That story has been confirmed by many people from both communities. In any case, eventually by the 50s, it became integrated. And so one of the very useful resources that I discovered in doing research on this neighborhood is the Harry E. Wood Facebook page. The folks from Harry E. Wood High School, which I'll mention in passing coming up, they have a remarkable Facebook page, and they really have excellent historical documentation there. And so there were some Black folks on the page also reminiscing about good times at the Oriental Theater in the 50s and possibly into the 60s. I'm not sure exactly when it was torn down. But here's a picture of Ms. Pete, who was on the call, and Judge Levy, two old neighbors and friends from the South Side, showing a picture of the Oriental Theater where it used to stand. And you can see that it's now the overpass for I-70. One thing that we found interesting in our interviews, and when I say we, I mean the students and me, because my students did a ton of interviews and recorded them and found all kinds of materials and scanned photos and did a terrific job, is that people would talk about their homes or businesses being under the highway. So we always had this image that if we could just dig up Meridian, that old neighborhood would just be there still intact under the highway, which of course it would not be, but it was just a kind of a nice way that people talked about it. It was still very alive in people's imaginations. Okay, the leisure activities. Michael Street Park is now known as Babe Denny Park. It's on Michael Street, just south of Church is the park. And it was renamed Babe Denny Park in 1977 after a Black officer from the neighborhood who became one of the first Park District employees. And the Denny family is still very much active and present on the South Side. The little boy who's at the center of this photo is Mr. William Craig. He gave us this photo. The parks in Indianapolis were never officially segregated, but they were informally segregated. And Douglas Park on the east side was kind of known as the Black Park. But Michael Street Park always had some level of integration, although I think the wading pool was probably mostly, if not exclusively, used by the African-American kids, but maybe some of the people on the call who are from the neighborhood can comment on that. The Communal building is the heart of the Jewish institutions that were once on the South Side. It was at 17 Morris Street. Again, it's torn down. It was originally built by the German community as a gymnasium, and then it was sold to the Jewish Welfare Federation of Indianapolis. And it was sold to be used as what were called settlement houses. We don't really use that term anymore. But in the early part of the 20th century, the settlement houses, which were all over the city and in other cities, were institutions that were set up mainly to serve immigrant communities and to kind of present sort of programs that were aimed at Americanizing immigrants. And so this was set up by the Jewish Welfare Federation to be a settlement house for the Jewish immigrants that were coming into the South Side at that time. You can see on the right the two articles about the naturalization committee. 16 men will receive their citizenship papers, and then a patriotic citizenship rally, letting people know that citizenship classes were held at the Communal building every Sunday evening. Now, I have to say something about the pronunciation. I'm not doing this in an idiosyncratic way, but we might look at this and say Communal building. However, no one from the South Side would say that. Everyone would say Communal building. So I urge you to pronounce it that way if you're ever discussing it with someone from the South Side, because I'm absolutely sure they will correct you otherwise. Here are some pictures that we got from activities at the Communal building. I love this one on the left from 1935. You can see on the left, the little boy with the dark sweater is our own Mr. Sidney Eskenazi, such an important figure in our city. And then on the right, the little boy with the white shirt on is Judge Levy. This was not actually in the Communal building. There was a building next door that was known as the Carolyn M. Kahn Memorial Log Cabin, and I can't quite envision what it looked like. But in any case, a lot of activities for kids, including scouting activities, took place actually in that annex. Here's a picture of Jewish women in a citizenship class and somebody's membership card from the Communal building from 1945 and 1946. So as the Jewish community started to migrate north, and the biggest waves of migration happened after World War II, the makeup of the neighborhood started to change. And so the Jewish Federation leased the building that had been the Communal building for $1 a year to what was called the Concord Center Association, which eventually purchased the building from the Jewish Federation and renamed it the Concord Center. And they set up the Concord Center to be non-sectarian, a non-sectarian interracial social group work agency serving all the neighborhood. And that is the identity that it still has very strongly, although in a different location, which I'll get to in a minute. We found this wonderful article about Mr. Enoch Mitchell, who was the custodian of the building at 17 West Morris Street for 47 years. And so as the article from 1975 says, thus ends another era in the structure, which has a history of 100 years, nearly all of them serving the people in the neighborhood. We know the Concord Center, as we know it now, is in a different location. They raised money in the late 70s to build another building that would be, I have to do more research into this, but the community centers in Indianapolis all seem to have kind of been designed by the same person, or at least they were designed on the same kind of plan. So money was raised to build a new building. This Concord Center has remained a very interracial space, as you can see from these pictures. In even as late as the 80s, a lot of the social service agencies still referred to the community centers around Indianapolis as settlement houses, even though they no longer really had the primary function of serving the needs of immigrants. That term was still used, and I pointed it out in the article. Indianapolis Settlements, Inc. received $200,000 grant for the construction of the new Concord Center. And the Concord Center still has that Indianapolis Settlement Inc. sign in its space. And here's the Concord Center as we know it today at 1310 South Meridian, always bringing people together. I have taught my Southside history classes at the Concord Center. I hope everyone will come by the Concord Center. In September, we're going to have an opening of an exhibit on the history of the Concord Center that's going to be displayed in the building, that was designed by our wonderful museum studies faculty and students based on research that had been done by my students. I'm just trying to keep track of time here. Another institution that people reminisced about was Meyer Chapel, or Meyer Chapel is actually how
All right.
Meyer, yes, thank you. And that was also a well-loved institution, and also a very interracial space that was originally an urban missionary project sponsored by Second Presbyterian Church. This article says that the building was erected in 1941, but I think it was actually built in 1891.
It was.
Yeah. And this is actually one of the few buildings, if not the only building, that I'm going to talk about that you can still see. I think maybe Shapiro's is the only other one. You can still go and see this building. Unfortunately, it's on West Norris. Unfortunately, it's now a work release facility, and I think it's kind of ironic that a building that once served, youth, is now a Department of corrections. Thank you, facility. But that's just the way it is. There was a lot in the old newspapers. I'll have to do more research into this, but at one point, United Fund, which I'm assuming is a precursor of the United Way, wanted to merge all of the settlement houses on the South Side, and Meyer Chapel rejected that. So I think there were some issues around funding that happened. But in any case, here's two great pictures from the Meyer Chapel bus with Kim Mayfield, who was a very active member of our team, and a picture in 1964 or 65 after a field trip to the Cincinnati Zoo. And on the right, Kim Mayfield's his picture of his baseball team with his particular friends circled. But you can see that it was a very interracial group of boys. Okay, the primary schools, and thank you, Ms. Pete, for this photo. I'm assuming Aaron Bellamy is Jackie Bellamy's son, so Ms.
Right,
Pete's grandson.
right. It's my
And
grandson. Yeah.
yes. So the schools on the south side, there were 3, 6, 12, and 22. They were very interesting schools to learn about, for us to learn about, because they were kind of informally integrated. They weren't integrated through design in this early period or through court orders or anything like that. They were integrated because basically it was a neglected part of the city and no one paid attention. And so the primary schools integrated as the makeup of the neighborhood changed. The main school, I think, that we focused on was School 22, and I think that's because most of the Jewish kids had gone to School 22. But some people in the neighborhood had gone to School 6, which was at 702 Union Street. The building was very small, as you can see, in 1867, and then in 1884 there was like an annex added, and then in 1931 the building was raised and rebuilt. These buildings have all been torn down, and I just can't even tell you how painful and kind of astonishing I find it that these very substantial buildings were knocked down. But anyway, that's the way it is. Here we have a very small graduating, 8th grade graduating class from 1935. I loved this little article that I found because I think people of my age, we remember going into the school auditorium to see the first spaceship go up with, who was it, with Alan Shepard in 1959, maybe. And I remember us all being marched into the school auditorium to see this. In 1929, the civics teacher at school number 6 arranged for a radio receiver to be brought in so that kids could hear Herbert Hoover's inauguration ceremony. I thought that was kind of cool. As I said, the Harry E. Wood High School Facebook page is a treasure trove of information. And Don Eaton is an amazing historian, local historian. And so here's the information about the rebuilt building, which was torn down in 1973. Now it's part of the entrance ramp to I-70. Here's an article from 1948. School number 6, twice built. The unity of its staff and pupils has resulted in strong school spirit. The next school is Robert Dale Owen School, IPS school number 12. Here's a picture of the school. Again, quite a substantial building. The 1949 principal, George Ostheimer. What was interesting in reading about the schools was that many of the schools were very proud of kind of the practical skills that they taught kids. There was a lot of emphasis on vocational instruction in the schools as well as academic instruction. And I think maybe, we could do with a return to that kind of curriculum. But in any case, this is the vacation school. So I guess that's what we would call summer school, a whittling class at Robert Dale Owen School from 1910. I just can't tell you how excited I was to find some of this material. It's just really interesting to me, and I hope to you. And then this picture of boys from the Robert Dale Owen School gathering plants for transplanting at home. A home beautification contest is being conducted by the school. So that's 1936. Now, what's interesting is looking at the graduation photos. We have some that we scanned in our archive, which I'll show you. These are from 1928 and 1932. So I don't think we have anything quite that early in the archive. But what's interesting is how the racial and ethnic makeup of the schools change as you look at the graduation photo. This photo from 1928, there are a lot of kids in that class with recognizably Jewish surnames. And I don't think there are any African-American kids. In 1932, it looks like there was just maybe 2 African-American boys in this class, and still a lot of kids with Jewish surnames. But then we get to 64, 65, and 69, 70, and you can see, I mean, if IPS today, the classes had this kind of racial makeup, we would be thrilled. I liked the picture on the left from 1932 of the school days beginning for the kindergarten kids. This was the January term, but since our kids are looking forward, I'm sure, to starting school, I think next week, I thought this seemed appropriate. So this is the kindergarten class in school 12 in 1932. So very interesting how you can kind of track the ethnic makeup of the neighborhood and how it changed by looking at the kids in the class pictures. School number 22, Nebraska Cropsey. You gotta love that name. I had to look up who Nebraska Cropsey was, and she was a very well-known educator. I have a little bio of her here. She lived from 1846 to 1916. She was an assistant superintendent of the Indianapolis Public Schools, and she was very well known and respected for her training of teachers. School 22 moved 3 times, and it's a very confusing history to me that somehow I have to sit down with Ms. Pete, and I'm sure she'll be able to outline exactly what happened when. But this is the school. Most of the pictures of the school were the school as it was at 1230 South Illinois. On the right, Meet Your Teacher. I thought this was interesting because she talked about the neighborhood as underprivileged, and indeed it was a poor neighborhood. But when you hear people talk about it, the kind of enthusiasm and nostalgia that infuses their stories, one doesn't really think about it that way. This is a fascinating article that I found, and I just wish that the reproduction were a little clearer, but this is talking about Americanization at School 22, where many of the pupils are of foreign birth. And this is from 1922. So that was the height of a lot of the Jewish immigration, not just to Indianapolis, but to the US in general. And they focus on 5 kids, 5 foreign-born children who neither speak nor understand English, if you can read the little caption under the kids' pictures. But when I looked at the kids' names and I looked them all up, they were all Jewish children. But it's interesting that the article didn't mention that. It mentioned them as being from Lithuania, Turkey, Russia. So very interesting little article. I love this picture at the bottom too. The school's lifeguards making a street crossing safe for children of foreign parents unacquainted with Indianapolis traffic laws. So I thought this was a fantastic find. And here we have some pictures of the graduating classes from School 22. And again, you can look at the differences. 1928 and 1930, heavily Jewish class. I don't think any African-American kids yet, but then moving into the 30s, much more mixed group. And into the 40s, even more so. And we have Leah Goldstein, who was Baby Lee. She was pictured as Baby Lee in front of Passo's drugstore, her little graduation certificate. From 1950. So really interesting to look at this, I think.
And my husband was in that picture too.
Oh, was he? Awesome.
In 47.
Great.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna, so this is my last, could people mute? Because I'm hearing a lot of noise that's a little distracting. So here I've referred to the Southside Jewish community, but I'm gonna give you a little more detail about it. The Southside Baking Company, Crafts, owned by Mr. Gerald Kraft, was one of the Jewish bakers on the South Side. There were several, but across the street was another well-known Jewish bakery, Regan's, which used to supply the rye bread for Shapiro's until they started making it in-house. Here's a picture of Shapiro's, which is our last vestige of that very vibrant Jewish community, for a postcard from the 1950s that was given to me by, or the scan was given to me by the Shapiro family. This ad from the Indiana Jewish Chronicle, I went through and looked for ads for Jewish businesses, and I tell you, there were some really fascinating and hilarious ones. And this one is my absolute favorite. Watch for the opening soon of Indianapolis's newest Jewish restaurant. And if you look, it says prepared by Jewish women who know their stuff. And I can tell you that there were a lot of excellent cooks in that neighborhood. I love this. Mrs. Bessie Goldstein, known for her excellent Chinese dinners. So I just wish that restaurant was still in operation, and that was on Illinois Street, which also had a very Jewish commercial district. This article appeared in the Indy Star in 1977, talking about the departure of the Southside Jewish neighborhood. 1977 is actually pretty late. There were a few businesses still left on the South Side at that point. But as I said, many of the residents had migrated north after World War II. This was a very close-knit community, and it still is in many ways. Here is the original home of Etz Chaim's Synagogue, which is very familiar to all of us who were involved in our Neighborhood of Saturdays project, but familiar to us at its current location, which is north of the JCC on Hoover Road. Here's the original building, which had been a Lutheran church, then became the synagogue, then became a church again, and then burned down. So that's an empty lot now. South Calvary, there were two Black churches in our area of the South Side, South Calvary and Bethesda Missionary Baptist Church. Both of them were involved in the project. Here's a picture, here's showing where South Calvary was. I'm not sure of the year of that photo, but it's still standing, but it's up for sale now. But it's right there in the middle of everything. And then you can see where the Jewish Communal building was, closer to Illinois. The last thing I'm going to talk about on the South Side was all the synagogues. There were at least 5 and possibly 6 synagogues. And when we first started with our Neighborhood of Saturdays project and first started meeting as a large group from both the Jewish and African-American communities, it was the African-American elders who knew where every synagogue was. I don't know if Miss Pete, if you remember this, but Jack Albaher and Mancy got into a debate about where a certain synagogue was, and Mancy, the African-American man, was right. So people were very familiar with these as institutions in their community. Here's a synagogue that was at Madison and Union. I haven't been able to find photos of some of these. Ezra Achim is particularly an interesting synagogue because it was known as the Peddler's Shul. Shul is a word for synagogue at 708 South Meridian. And it was called that because it was a very impoverished congregation that were mostly peddlers. So most of these synagogues ended up merging with one another and then moving north. Here's a synagogue that was at South Meridian. And again, look at the grandeur of that building. That's the only picture I've been able to find, but I mean, remarkable building, and again, torn down. And this, I'm just going to spend a minute talking about Shaarei Tefillah Synagogue. One thing that was very interesting about this synagogue, it's a beautiful building, as you'll see in the moment. It was a beautiful building, but it was right adjacent to Harry E. Wood High School. So the Harry E. Wood Facebook page actually has a lot of information about Shaarei Tefillah. This picture of the school, Harry E. Wood High School, showing this bridge that connected 2 parts of the building. If you see in the front, those 2 columns, that was part of Shaarei Tefillah. So they were neighbors. And and here's how beautiful this building was. I mean, it's just a phenomenal looking building. And there was a lot of reminiscing on the Harry E. Wood Facebook page about Shaarei Tefillah, people remembering walking past it. And I don't know who Larry DeVore is, and I took this off the Facebook page, so I hope you won't mind, but I just loved this little reminiscence of his. I remember being in science class on the 3rd floor and looking down into the open windows of the synagogue and seeing them in prayer and doing their rites, thinking how strange it was to see the men on the main floor and the women above in the balconies, singing their prayers in Hebrew, an unknown language to me at that time in my life. I was very touched by that little reminiscence of the kids from Harry Wood. There were very few Jewish kids in the neighborhood at by that time, just curious and interested to know what was going on in these synagogues that were right amidst their, everyday life, amidst them in their everyday life. Sadly, torn down in 1966. This is just my final slide. Our project, the Neighborhood of Saturdays, we produced a book written mostly by students. It unfortunately is out of print because the publisher went out of business, but you can until we get a new publisher, you can download a copy on the Neighborhood of Saturdays website. And one of the most exciting experiences that we had was in 2012 when a reporter came from the New York Times to cover the project and wrote a beautiful article about the history of the neighborhood. And we all participated together in an interfaith worship service at South Calvary Baptist Church. And that's Reverend Woodall from the church and Judge Levy making some remarks on that day that I don't think any of us who were there will forget. So I'd like to thank all of these folks, the University Library, the Neighborhood of Saturday students and community participants, Michael Brown, who's a very avid finder of interesting articles, and the Indiana Jewish Historical Society, Dawn Eaton and Carol Amonette Ogden, who managed the Harry E. Wood High School Facebook page, my colleague Paul Mullins, known to some of you, I'm sure, who taught me how to do a lot of this research using the historic maps and the newspaper archives. And thank you to the Propylaeum for this invitation. So I'm going to stop share. And I think I did finish in 45 minutes and see if there's any questions out there.
What brought you to Indianapolis, and what was the most surprising thing you learned during your research?
Oh, great. Well, what brought me to Indianapolis was this job at IUPUI. So that's why I came. I was offered a faculty position in the department here, and I had been in another institution where I wasn't very happy. So it was a wonderful opportunity for me to make a move. And what was the most surprising thing? Well, the Millers can maybe comment on this. Beatrice Miller, AKA Ms. Pete, and her daughter Beverly, who are on the Zoom. But when I first started out, the project started to be, what surprised me was, I guess, in this particular case, was the attachment that people still had to the space of this neighborhood, even though it looks so different now and it's been, basically ruined by I-70 and Lucas Oil Stadium, the deep attachment that people still have to the physical space. So every year on the first Saturday of August, I'm sorry, I'm across the street from the hospital, so we have a siren going by. Every year on the first Saturday in August, so coming up in a week, right? All right, everybody's welcome, right? On the first Saturday in August, down in Babe Denny Park, which used to be Michael Street Park, down at Michael and Church, there will be a neighborhood reunion. And I first heard about this from Ms. Miller's Ms. Pete and Beverly's sister, Mrs. Bellamy, Jackie Bellamy, that I heard about this reunion picnic. We were, Jackie and I were at a workshop together learning about how to get funding for community projects. And Jackie told me about this first Saturday in August picnic. And I was kind of flabbergasted that people still came back to the neighborhood. So I wanted to know why. Why were people so attached to this space? And so when I went to the first Saturday, and I had assumed erroneously that it was a predominantly African-American neighborhood. And when I went to the first picnic, the Miller family invited me and took me around and introduced me to people. This was, I can't remember if it was 2008 or 2009. And I started talking to people about the neighborhood and why they remained so attached to it. A lot of them talked to me and reminisced about their former Jewish neighbors. So then we tracked down the Jewish neighbors. I won't even go into that story, and brought everyone together. And so it was just amazing how everyone really reconnected and had these shared memories of that space. Yeah, I agree with David Steele, who posted that the South Side is a neglected area. Of course, there's other parts of the South Side that maybe are a little bit more well-known, like Garfield Park. But I agree that, I loved discovering this part of the city that people didn't seem to know that much about. And yet it has such a fascinating and lively history.
Can you talk about, and I hope I didn't miss it at the beginning, the title of your work, The Neighborhoods of Saturdays?
Yes.
Can you talk about that?
Yes, thank you. So the first title that we had a little committee of folks when we were going to work on this project, and I was going to bring the students in, which I did, to do interviews and to collect materials. we were going to call it First Saturday in August because that's the reunion picnic, mostly African-American attendees, but in more recent years, some of the Jewish folks came back to participate. And so the name of the book, I didn't know it was going to be a book at that time, but the name of the project was going to be the First Saturday in August. But then when the Jewish folks came in, we thought that title wasn't quite inclusive enough and broad enough. And the celebration of the Jewish Sabbath is on Saturdays. So the neighborhood of Saturdays referred to all of the Saturday things that happen in that neighborhood.
What is missing? What are you still looking for from the neighborhood?
As a researcher?
Yeah, are there specific photographs or buildings that you would like to track down?
Well, I definitely would love to have a picture of the Peddler's Shoal, that synagogue. No one's been able to find a picture of that. The Indiana Jewish Historic Society's been on that mission for a while, but also more pictures of some of the Black businesses. There were other Black businesses that people reminisced about. And I couldn't even find ads for them. I searched the Indianapolis Recorder. So it would be great to find more pictures of those institutions, but any pictures from that neighborhood, I'm always excited to find, and we put them up on our website for people to see. Francesca asked if there's an equivalent neighborhood. I don't know. What does everyone think? I don't know if there's an equivalent neighborhood. I feel like that was a neighborhood of a particular time and place. There's certainly integrated neighborhoods in Indianapolis, or some that are more or less integrated, but I don't know that there's any neighborhood exactly like the neighborhood of Saturdays. But Ms. Pete, you have a comment.
And you're so right, because what happened was, even as a child, I moved into another neighborhood. I haven't found one like the Southside. And not only that, our relationship that we had, and what you raised an issue earlier about the things that we did. I want to emphasize the fact that 99% of the people in our area went to work every day. Nobody sat at home waiting on someone to give them something. So ours was a family community, Jewish and Black. And with the things that we developed, like you said, my daughter introduced you, and it's been on ever since. And I'm happy to know you, Sue. Okay.
Well, I'm very happy to know you, Ms. Pete. You've been the glue that's held us all together all of these years, and Beverly as well. And David, yes, I heard about Hayes General Store. Several people mentioned it, but no one could find a photo. So, oh, that's your grandpa. Well, that's awesome. So yeah, if you have, I'm just going to put my email address here. So if people have photos that they can scan and send me, or if you need me to come and scan them, as people who are part of the project know, we have portable scanners. We go around, we'll scan anything, anywhere. So there's my email address.
Debbie, are you raising your hand?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh,
Oh,
okay.
Debbie, I'm so happy to see. Debbie Beecham is actually a Paso, and her father was one of the brothers who owned Paso's drugstore. And we've written on email, but I've never seen you. So it's so nice to see you. Thank you for coming.
I am so grateful to you for having the students write the book, but also talking about my dad's drugstore, because I'm a former teacher, and I used to tell the kids in my class about my experiences down the drugstore. And it still has had the most incredible positive influence on my life. And I always, because my grandparents were down there also on Union Street. And I have to say, I used to think I was Pollyanna when I thought about the South Side of Indianapolis, because of my experiences working with Dad from the time I was 12 years old until I can't remember when I stopped. But I have to say, when I read your book, I sobbed, because what it proved to me that it's not that it was utopia by any means, but it was a community. And when you asked if it's ever been duplicated, I can't even imagine that happening because of Dad's customers, the influence they had on me, Shapiro's, my grandparents. It formed me more than the north side of Indianapolis. So Susan, I thank you 100 times over for pulling this information. And I do have some pictures I've discovered of my dad, some of my dad's drugstore a little bit, not the
Oh,
outside,
great.
the inside. So I will
Oh,
be,
great.
I
Oh,
will be sending
wonderful.
those to you. I'm excited too. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, the stories have just been so wonderful. There are no more synagogues in that neighborhood. Kurosh asked that question. There are no standing synagogues on the south side. A number of them merged, and they're all on the north side up in that kind of Hoover Road area, or further north in Carmel, like Sharei Tefillah that I was talking about. That synagogue, that congregation is now in Carmel. One thing we were talking about before the session officially started was there is an old synagogue still standing in Mapleton Fall Creek at Ruckel, on Ruckel Street. That's a synagogue that's, you know, not been used in years. It became a church after it was a synagogue, and then it's been vacant for many, many, many years. And it's architecturally significant building because it was designed by Vonnegut and Bone, the famous architectural firm related to Kurt Vonnegut. But it would be, you know, so much money to rehabilitate it. It's owned by Indiana Landmarks, and I had a tour of it once. With them, and it's in very, very poor repair, unfortunately. And there's no parking because Orthodox Jewish people would walk to the synagogue. They wouldn't drive on the Sabbath. Yes, Ruckel and 34th in Mapleton Fall Creek. And people would walk to the synagogue, so there was no parking lot because everyone lived right there like a little enclave. So I can't think how it could be adapted for contemporary use, but I don't know, but I'm since it hasn't been torn down yet, I'm at least hopeful that that something might come of it at some point. I mean, it would be beautiful to just have it be a museum, but that's very, very expensive. So I don't know, unless, you know, Steven Spielberg or someone becomes interested. I don't know how we could raise funds for something like that. The Indiana album does have some photos. I think I've used some of their photos. And the Neighborhood of Saturday's website, when you go there, there's over 400 images that were scanned from people in the neighborhood. And we'll be adding more soon, it sounds like.
Dr. Hyatt, what is next for you? Are you just gonna?
Well, retirement is coming up in the not too distant future, but in 2020, we started to do a project that was a follow-up to the Neighborhood of Saturdays that was really advocated for by Debbie's cousin. I think he would be Sam, right? Sam Passo. And he really wants us to do a project called the Neighborhood of Saturday Nights. And all credit to him for coming up with a very clever title. But that would be the story of the next generation, Debbie, Beverly, me. I mean, I grew up in that generation. The people who grew up, they didn't grow up on the south side. By then, their parents had moved north, but some of them still had grandparents, as you mentioned, Debbie, on the south side. And but our experiences, I mean, I'm putting myself into the story, but I'm not really in the story, but it is my era. The experience of just growing up in the 60s, what they remember of the south side. And some of their stories, like particularly about Shortridge High School and North Central High School. And then that's where we would get into the history of Harry E. Wood High School. I think Beverly is a proud woodchuck, right?
Yes, okay, the school fight song.
Yes.
So I was gonna
remember
say,
those fight songs.
even
So,
growing up, when I walked to Wood High School, I do remember that synagogue being across from, it was across from the Harley Davidson shop. So since you guys It was a
There are
close-
pictures of the Harley Davidson shop on the Harry E. Wood High School Facebook page. It is just amazing the historical material they've amassed there, and they've been very generous about telling me to use it. It's a closed group, so you have to ask to become a member. And but if you tell them that you're interested in the history of the Southside, I think they'll let you in. They let me in. So
Mhm.
And I do remember that synagogue being there right by on
Yeah.
Merrill Street where the underpass was at. Oh my, I do remember that very well, very well.
but yeah, I'm really delighted that people came and were so interested. And John Laughlin was on the call. And if you want to know anything about Harry E. Wood High School, the first person I would go to would be John Laughlin and Don Eaton and Carol Eminette Ogden from the Facebook page. I've met John in person. I've never met Don or Carol, but the three of them are just phenomenal historians of IPS and particularly of Wood High School, which it has its own very interesting story.
So thank you all so much again, Dr. Hyatt. Thank you for a great program.
Thank you.
Have
Thank
a good
you
evening.
for the organizing. Thanks.